today. Happy Friday to all. I'm excited to get to chat with you about a recent project that I've been thinking a lot about. And those of you that know me might think of me as the amphibian and reptiles person in the Rubenstein School. Today, we're actually going to change things up and talk about my other interest, which relates to supporting decision makers and disease ecology. So since I haven't presented over here at the gun before, I wanted to take just 2 minutes to talk about my larger sort of research portfolio and interests. As Leslie mentioned, our team does applied science, kind of on both sides of what I see as this sort of cyclical framework here. So some of the research, like that I'll talk about today, is really designed to support decision makers who are contemplating whether and how and when to intervene in a natural system. And sort of the other half is then working on the back end with those folks after they've decided to intervene or take action to figure out whether actions they took had the desired impact. My research areas here are sort of disease ecology, population ecology, and conservation decisions. So on the disease ecology side, there are lots of diseases, unfortunately, that we are managing both on the wildlife side and in broader sectors, as I'll talk about today. Some that our group works with, again, relate to amphibians, but also to wildlife. So we study SARS-CoV-2 and chronic wasting disease. Chronic wasting disease is the topic for today. And also just the general challenges that come with trying to detect very tiny things, very cryptic things, very new things, and how we might design models that help us better learn to use pathogen detection data. On the population side, we study where species occur, or maybe more interestingly, where they don't occur, and what's driving their populations up or down. And particularly in relation to stressors, disease being one of them, but others as well. And then the conservation decisions angle is working with folks who are in these positions of authority and who are trying to decide when and how to intervene. So this side of things is a little bit more on the social science side of the spectrum. We're trying to understand what causes someone to choose to make a decision, what causes them to stall or be paralyzed by a decision. And are there uncertainties on the science side, perhaps in these other bins, that if resolved would allow them to move forward with their decision process? So I selected the topic I'm planning to present today because it kind of falls at the intersection of all three of these. So I just wanted to acknowledge before I get going here that this work is done with a large group of partners who you'll come to hear about as I go through the presentation. But much credit should be given to these folks down here on the bottom within the state of Vermont. Especially, we have the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, the Vermont Department of Health, and the Vermont Agency of Ag, Food, and Markets. We're also working with federal partners, USDA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, and US Forest Service. And then my partners on the sort of facilitation side of the team are with the US Geological Survey and the Disease Decision Analysis and Research Group. Emerging infectious diseases are on the rise. We remain part of now a global endemic related to COVID-19. And many of these diseases that humans are coping with have animal origins. In fact, the majority of them do. Even non-zoonotic diseases, like some of the ones that I study, have huge impacts on populations of humans, health and wellness, economics, and agriculture. And so it's important to start to think about these diseases rather than solely in the wildlife biology and management bin, as we kind of have done historically, but more broadly. And I think thinking across these sectors will help us come up with better solutions. And just a note here that in general, when we see negative outcomes from diseases impacting human society, it tends to be the most vulnerable societal groups that feel these impacts the most rapidly and the most intensely. So there's a huge equity angle to consider here. We think about intervening on a wildlife disease, or really any disease. We can think of proactive and reactive measures. what could we do before this disease arrives here? And what might we do after it arrives? And the actions that we might consider taking are typically state dependent. You would do certain things if you were trying to prevent something from arriving, and different things if you were coping with something that was already established. So this figure here just shows kind of a schematic of a theoretical host and pathogen population, where the pathogen is invading very early in the time series, and the host has some type of typical fluctuation. And over time, the pathogen population is increasing while the host population is declining. We know, and yet we do not listen, that proactive measures tend to outperform reactive measures, both in terms of the effectiveness of thwarting the actual invasion and in terms of cost. Some of the actually more conservative estimates related to COVID-19 that have come out indicate that if we had just spent 5 cents to the dollar on what we spent to respond to that pandemic, we could have potentially prevented it. So there's a financial savings there, there's an efficiency savings there, and yet we do see very few instances of these proactive interventions at play in the real world. Why is this? One, I think that in ecology, in disease ecology, in public health, in many ways, we are crisis disciplines that respond to problems that have already emerged. And there are certainly plenty of those to respond to. Maybe it's that we just don't have the bandwidth or the funding or the time to think as preemptively as perhaps would be ideal. Even beyond that, there might be other reasons why it's hard to know how to intervene proactively. These are super complex systems. We're dealing often with novel pathogens where we don't know things like modes of transmission or environmental tolerances or potential impacts. And so perhaps those uncertainties lend themselves to us playing a little bit more of the wait and see game rather than developing interventions. And then the third piece is that there's a different level of complexity beyond the ecological system, and that's the socioeconomic or socioecological complexity of governance. So some of these pathogens or disease systems, again, whether or not they're zoonotic, can have impacts across multiple sectors. So in a perfect world, wildlife biologists and human health professionals and agricultural health professionals would not be in their individual silos. They'd be thinking about how a disease that's emerging in one sector may have impacts on other sectors. And they'd be working together to see if there are actually creative solutions, if they were to pool their authorities that would allow for better proactive management. So this is the sort of stage setting that brings us to how do you deal with ecological complexity and social complexity as well. A path that I'm going to present today is using the tools of decision science, especially structured decision making, which is a facilitation step that essentially helps stakeholders work through all aspects of a problem, starting with really trying to figure out what the heck the problem even is in the first place, and then focusing on their values and bringing everyone to the table who has a stake in the potential outcomes that happen regardless of whether or not we intervene. So the PROACT framework is the framework that we use. There are multiple of these structured sorts of frameworks that can be used. There will not be a quiz on this, so you don't have to remember all the steps, but PROACT is sort of the shorthand for problem, objectives, actions, consequences, trade-offs. And the idea is that by the time you get to the end, you're in a situation where you can make a decision. I'd be happy to talk more about this framework. It's one I use in my own life frequently when trying to decide what to do, when to do, and how to do it. And so it's super useful. But today, this is essentially how my talk is broken up. I want to introduce you to the problem that we're facing here in Vermont and essentially how this team has been assembled to try to solve it. Often, feels surreal to be discussing right now. Decisions are made, especially by governments, in ways that are not especially defensible or transparent. It's unclear if a process was followed to reach that decision. It's unclear whose voices were listened to when those decisions were made. So benefits of this structured process are that the decision is deliberative, it's thorough, it follows this process, and it's highly documented. So not only is it more likely to achieve desired outcomes, because that's where it starts with what do we want the future to look like, but it's more likely to be accepted by others because there's actually a track record of showing how the different twists and turns in any complex problem were navigated. And on the sort of proactive and reactive management side of things, another benefit is we can sort of explicitly and quantitatively evaluate what are the trade-offs between intervening early and or waiting, potentially knowing more about the system and intervening later. So it helps us think about that proactive reactive management conundrum. So today we'll talk through the state of Vermont's quest to consider both proactive and reactive management activities as it relates to a disease of concern across multiple sectors. And we'll cover kind of all pieces of this PROACT cycle. And this is not a resolved project yet. We are sort of at the tail end, right around here. And so I'll also tell you what we expect to be coming up next. So chronic wasting disease is the disease that I'm here to talk about. It's a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. It's caused by a prion, which is a misfolded protein. So it's not caused by a virus or bacteria or fungi. It's one of these other disease-causing agents. And it's 100% fatal in cervids. So in Vermont, we're specifically thinking about our white-tailed deer, but in other places, thinking about mule deer, elk, and moose. Is it a human health concern? Maybe. There's no evidence at this time that CWD can jump from deer to humans. At the same time, there are human prion diseases. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is one such disease, also 100% lethal, also a terrible disease. And the species barrier is not well understood in these prion diseases in general. So the current guidance from the Center for Disease Control is that folks who harvest animals in CWD positive areas should have that game tested. And if it tests positive, they should not consume that game. So it's sort of we're kind of in the middle here. No, there's no evidence that it's zoonotic. And also please do not consume CWD positive game because the risk, the impact is so great, even if the risk may be low of a spillover event. At this time, CWD is spreading in North America. Importantly, it's spreading both in wild deer and also in captive settings. So deer farms, which exist throughout the United States in very high numbers. The disease was first found in a captive facility in Colorado in the 1970s, and since then has sort of been spreading rapidly. In some ways, a wave-like spread that you might assume from wild interactions of deer, but also you'll notice on this figure some jumps that often originate in captive facilities due to animal trade and animal movement. What does CWD do once it arrives? Wisconsin is a place that loves its deer and studies its deer in a very detailed way. So much of our best data comes from Wisconsin, where the disease has been present for 2 decades now. And what we have learned is that infected animals have much lower survival than uninfected animals, and there is a bit of a sex difference there. And if we look at prevalence across the x-axis of this figure down on the bottom, so that's the proportion of adults that are infected by chronic wasting disease. And we look at their population growth rate. If you think back to introductory ecology, as lambda, right? Populations with lambdas above 1 are growing, at 1 are stable, and below 1 are declining. So we see that as prevalence increases past something like 30%, we do see actual population level declines. Again, perhaps not surprising because this is 100% fatal disease. One other thing I'd like to add here is that there are challenges associated with detecting this disease because animals that are infected may not become clinical, meaning they may not look sick or die for something like 18 months or 2 years or even 3 years. So it's a very slow progression. Throughout all that time, they are shedding infectious prions and potentially infecting new individuals, but the disease can be somewhat silent initially. To me, deer are not amphibians or reptiles, but other people seem to really like them. They have pretty tremendous value to us in lots of different ways. Cultural value, recreational value. In places like Vermont, the license sales from deer harvest support all of the non-game conservation work that we do in the state. So thinking about a future where deer populations decline has implications beyond the ecological, but also for people and for our ability to do conservation work. Here we are in Vermont. We don't have any of these little captive or wild infection detections in our state at this time. So that puts Vermont in a position where they can still make proactive choices. And just last year, in 2024, New York detected chronic wasting disease in a captive facility in the southern end of Herkimer County, down here. And that was about 90 miles from the Vermont border. So prior to this detection, we were really thinking about Pennsylvania as the current hotspot of natural spread that will eventually walk its way to us. But I think this detection, as well as a detection in Quebec in 2018, have both highlighted that this disease really may be knocking on our door. And we may not have the 2 decades it would take for a deer to walk here from Pennsylvania to consider proactive management. We really need to be thinking about this immediately if we still want to have a chance at intervening before it's here. So that's the problem. And again, this is not necessarily my telling of the problem. This problem statement that I've just delivered to you was co-developed with the agency decision makers here in the state. So this is what they're seeing. This is the why now for them. What is the trigger? Why are we engaging in this process now? It's because it's coming for us, and we've seen states around us have to respond to this in the moment, and perhaps not have the time to make the choices that they wish they had made. So Vermont really wants to seize this opportunity. So the next part is objectives. What do we care about? So I always start here with this little quote from Alice in Wonderland. One day Alice came to a fork in the road and saw a Cheshire cat in the tree. Which road do I take, she asked. Where do you want to go, was his response. I don't know, Alice answered. Then, said the cat, it doesn't matter. So if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And perhaps that's the real decision-making process that we see being acted out in many arenas. But a more rigorous process, a better process, to spend a lot of time thinking about what you and the stakeholders value, what your ideal future looks like. And then we can sort of use that information as essentially a sieve to understand what actions we should take today to make sure we end up where we want it to go. So I'm going to cover next what the stakeholders valued. So decisions, to me, are always an expression of one's values. So we're ultimately trying to get the state to a decision point. The only way we can get there is if we understand what they care about. These were generated in a variety of ways. Some of the states said there's actual statute that tells us what we have to do. One of those cases here is in Title 10, related to Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, where this statement appears: an abundant, healthy deer herd is a primary goal of fish and wildlife management in Vermont. That is the statute that they are bound to. And so that led them to translate 2 objectives related to deer. To them, this sentence said there's supposed to be a lot of deer and they're supposed to be healthy. And so chronic wasting disease prevalence is not a sign of health. And it wouldn't be enough if we had a tiny deer herd that was very healthy. We would ideally want a bigger deer herd. So other stakeholders approach this in different ways, sometimes embedded in the agency mission. There was context. Sometimes it was really the folks in the room and the current decision makers and sort of chain of command that was present, thinking about what they're actually valuing at this time. So I'll summarize. These are not the exact objectives that came up, since I feel like that information is not quite ready to be public facing yet, but they're general enough that you'll get the picture. So we started this process about 2 years ago with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department as our primary partner. And again, they came up with these first two objectives based on the Title 10 statute. However, the more they thought about this relates to their wild white-tailed deer herds, they thought about other things that they might value and other things that might be related to these. So here's where agency mission comes in. Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department is not there just for the wildlife. They're also supposed to provide recreational opportunities for Vermonters. And so there's concern that as the deer population changes and as chronic wasting disease arrives, it may impact the number of hunters that we have. So that's something that they valued. They wanted to keep that number fairly high. And then they're also tasked not with just the wildlife, but supporting ecosystem health. And so they thought about habitat. They thought about how changing deer numbers may impact things like forest regeneration. And that actually led them to bring in an additional partner who could provide more expertise there, and as a major landholder in the state of Vermont, would likely be invested in any type of action that might eventually be taken that could have implications on our forest health. So now we've got the U.S. Forest Service at the table, where we had first just had Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And I left off their icon, but we also have Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation, again, weighing in on this forest piece. Then Vermont Fish and Wildlife said, we're not sure whose job this is, but it feels like it's kind of ours to think about the revenue piece. Yes, because the revenue from hunting sales comes back to us to do conservation work, but also because of all the sort of local industries that pop up related to the hunting season. So local taxidermists, local processors, mom and pop shops that have these check stations where folks can check their game and might also buy a coffee or a sandwich. There are implications, especially, again, thinking about our more vulnerable Vermont communities, some of the more rural communities, where this source of revenue that, again, is largely not tracked by any sector, may be really critical. And it's something that they expressed they wanted to value. Partway through this discussion, we started talking about the captive deer herds, which again, in many states, that is where the initial invasion of CWD has occurred. And Vermont Fish and Wildlife said, well, we don't manage those. In some states, the Wildlife Agency does. In other places, it's the Agricultural Agency. So in Vermont, it's Vermont Agency of Ag, Food and Markets. And so we invited those folks to come to the table to help us think about how the captive cervid industry in Vermont, which is about 10 farms strong, might play a role in the solutions that we might think about for this challenge. So they also accepted and joined the group. And then we've got this human health angle that, again, the direct human impact, sort of a question mark right now. There are certainly human health communication challenges associated with this disease that we expect to pop up as soon as the disease gets a little closer. Folks will start to wonder, where can I test my meat? What am I supposed to do? What if I already ate some of it? These are things that Vermont Fish and Wildlife is not equipped to deal with. And so really there should be public health professionals that are part of this informed public sort of goal. And then there's the question of food security. Again, back to thinking about our most vulnerable Vermonters who rely on the harvest as a key source of protein. What does it look like if changing deer abundance or CWD prevalence removes that food source? So Department of Health is another partner that has come to the table. any plan in Vermont or anywhere has to consider cost. So cost was also an objective that multiple agencies brought forward, just that whatever we do has to be the right balance of spending to success. So this represents kind of our multi-sector objectives. And again, throughout various pieces of this puzzle, the equity lens has been incorporated. In Vermont, it really seems like of these agencies that I've worked with, they are thinking about their community members and their constituents. They're not making decisions based on just what the agency wants to do. They're really kind of thinking broadly about what their mandates are and who they represent. So that's been really great to see. So this is a summary of the final group of partners. We've got Department of Health, Agency Ag and Markets, and then a variety of folks over here in the ecological sector. And all of these people are working together and are generating the ideas that I get to be here presenting today. So that covers the objectives. Now we're on to the actions. Now we know what we care about. We know where we want to end up. How do we figure out which path to take to get there? And the goal that the state has is to write this multi-sector, multi-agency plan that outlines what the plan is, and both proactive and reactive steps. So at this point, they've brainstormed many different options. And those I've represented here on this figure. Again, I'm not going to tell you exactly what's inside all of these potential alternatives, but I'll just say that they span the spectrum of highly intensive proactive and reactive management to minimally intensive in one or the other or both. So they've sort of designed these to explore the whole possible space of what they could do. We call something like alternative 6 there in the top right, the kitchen sink. What if we did it all? What if we prepared proactively as hard as we could and reactively as hard as we could once we detect it? What would that look like? Would that get us closer to the future that we are envisioning as a group? And how much would it cost? And then we've got others that kind of are more intermediate. So these include things, these strategies, which are groups of actions, include interventions that multiple agencies would be taking. So what would the Department of Health do on the proactive side, on the reactive side? What would the Agency of Ag do related to those captive herds? What would the state do? Are there things like density reductions that might be really unpalatable to some parts of the public, but that might maximize our chance of slowing the spread once it arrives? So those types of things, we have maybe 60 actions, are bundled into these separate strategies. So how do we know which one? How do we know how to move forward? The goal would be to pick the strategy that best meets your objectives. If there was somehow magically a win-win-win-win-win type strategy, that would be easy. We pick that one. Most likely that one's going to at least be expensive, right? And so it gets docked a little bit there. So the way that we do this is we need to be able to predict for each objective what an intervention looks like in the future. Okay, and I have some visuals that can help you think through this. So if we knew how each strategy would impact the performance of those things that we care about, then we could figure out which strategy best meets our objectives. So in the end, envision a table. We have the things that we care about here, our objectives on this side. We have the potential strategies across the top. And in a perfect world, I have a model for deer abundance. And in that model, I implement the actions associated with strategy 1, and I compute. And I figure out how many deer does that leave me with at the end of 25 years or 50 years. I plug that in there. And I can do that for every strategy. And so then for that objective, I can see, well, if all I cared about was deer abundance, strategy 3 gets me the most deer. Now we go on through the table because all I care about is not deer abundance. In fact, I care about all of these things. So essentially the idea here is we have models underpinning each objective, and those will help us predict outcomes for each strategy. And in the end, you might get something that looks like this. Now, again, if we saw a column that was this dark green across all objectives, this would be an easier solution, right? Be like, oh, one strategy, it wins at each objective. It's somehow the cheapest, and it keeps CWD out the longest, and it keeps lots of deer and lots of happy hunters, and there's money for all the taxidermists and processors, and all the humans know just what to do. And they're not eating the CWD tainted meat, etc. We're likely to get something more like this. This is demonstrating kind of the final T of the PROACT cycle, which is trade-offs. There are trade-offs that the decision makers have to grapple with. So our team, our job is really to help provide the information as best that we can, and then to sit back and to let the decision makers grapple with those trade-offs. They are the ones that have to decide essentially how much some of these things might be valued above others. How much money could be rallied now or in the event of a detection? Which of these are most feasible? So at this point, we've developed models that sort of vary in their complexity for each of these bins. It's been a huge project. And in this bin, and this bin is kind of where our UVM team has focused most of its work. And I want to give credit to Annabelle Stanley, who's a PhD student who works with me on this project, who has just done an incredible job at putting together these prototypes so that the state can give us feedback. Right now, we're working with much simpler models for some of these other bins, but there are models underpinning all of these objectives at this time. So I'm going to close out by just telling you how we got to where we are and what's left. As I mentioned, we started back in September 2023. We started with just Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Pretty quickly, they identified over the course of 2 meetings that other partners needed to be at the table. And at that meeting, that's where Agency of Ag and Department of Health joined up for the first time. And as a result of that meeting, it was highlighted that in the event of taking action, lots of other groups would be involved. Forest Parks and Rec would be involved. The refuges might be able to pitch in and regulate. The Forest Service, it's a major landholder that would have some power to help us intervene. USDA APHIS would be a team that could be contracted for any sharpshooting type density reductions. And so that's this task force, is everyone. It's the 3 primary decision makers plus folks who would, whose cooperation would be critical to actually being able to mount a response. And that's this group here. Yes, and the wardens as well. So we're at January 2025. We met just a few weeks ago. We presented our prototypes for all of these models. We got feedback, great feedback, lots of feedback on what did and did not make sense. Agency of Ag, for instance, helped us think through, it's not just about the farms, but what's the probability of an introduction to a captive farm right now? And if you took some of the actions you've proposed, like mandating double fences around all of your farms, how much could we reduce that probability by? So they're helping us to inform not just the structure of the model, but the actual impacts as well. And so we're revising those models now over the next few months and currently slated to have our final prototype ready in May 2025. So that's when we'll present something like that big table. And that's when this really important grappling of trade-offs discussion will happen. The goal from the state's angle is at the end of that meeting to walk out with a unified sort of philosophy about which of those proactive and reactive strategies they're happy with. And then they'll move forward with drafting a plan that would then be signed by all agencies and hopefully filed and completed by the end of the year. So just to summarize, I know that surprises are waiting for us in May and in the months leading up to May. But in general, this has been a really positive project to be a part of, where people actually are focused on a similar problem. They're willing to work together. They're willing to think outside of the box. I think some of that is because Vermont is a small state, and the people that we had in the room were not meeting for the first time. And the hierarchies are a little smaller here, right? If we're discussing an idea, someone can pick up the phone and call their commissioner. They have their cell phone number and can say, is this something we could put on the table? And so it feels like we're really connected to the people who can make these decisions, who have that authority, and that, again, I'm sure surprises are coming, but that right now, everyone seems to be on the same page. There are challenges, of course, also being with a small state, and one of that is resources. There's a lot of concern about how we would find the funds to do whatever folks decide needs to be done, and whether that would come as an installment from the Vermont government, or whether it would actually take away from individual agencies' ability to do the work that they do now. And those things feel very different. So we're trying to figure out how to navigate that cost piece. As far as I'm aware, no other state has proactively prepared for this disease. So that's just also really exciting to be in this place. I think most people in the room are still hoping it doesn't arrive until after they're retired. But I think they feel good about the fact that if it does, they will not be a state that's writing a response plan in a weekend and hoping that it works, that they spent this time investing in the best plan possible. So again, just want to thank the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department group who helped us kick off this entire project, as well as all of the other agencies. And another nod to Annabelle here in the Rubenstein School, and the other members of the facilitation team who are our USGS partners, Mike Runge and John Cook. Okay, and with that, I'm happy to answer questions.